Welcome to our podcast from Lime Solicitors on the subject of the Jesus Fellowship Church Individual Redress Payment Scheme. My name is Malcolm Johnson and I head Lime Solicitors Abuse Compensation Department. And today, myself and Henna Ahmed will be talking about the way in which this compensation scheme works. Lime Solicitors acts for over 100 survivors of abuse in the Jesus Fellowship Church, and our team was involved in the drafting of a compensation scheme which has been set up to compensate survivors. Now, I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Henna, who's been working on the compensation scheme since it accepted at the end of September last year.
Thank you, Malcolm. Hello, I'm Henna Ahmed and I manage Lime Solicitors' list of survivors. I've taken a number of statements from survivors over the course of the past few months, and I advise clients on offers that are made under the scheme and what counter offers should be made on their behalf. So the material for this podcast has been designed for the benefit of anyone who is considering making or who is making a claim to the Jesus Fellowship Church Individual Redress Payment Scheme. However, it is not intended to be relied upon for giving advice in specific cases. If you want some brief, free advice on how this scheme works, or you want to know whether you should make a claim, or you have already instructed us, please ring or email either myself or Malcolm. You can reach us on Lime Solicitors' general number, or you can find our contact details on the firm's website. In any event, let's now talk about the Jesus Army and the scheme itself. Malcolm, please can you tell us who the Jesus Army are?
Thanks, Henna. So very briefly, the Jesus Fellowship Church, as it's named, was founded by a man called Noel Stanton in around 1969, and it was also known as a New Creation Christian Community and the Jesus Army. Now, it began in a very loose form as an evangelical, an independent Christian church, but it managed to grow very rapidly indeed. And at its height, it had thousands of members and owned properties all over the country. Now, the members, not all of them, but most, would live in communes, and the church also had its own businesses in which members would work. Now, over the years, the church became very well known for appearing on the streets of various cities, carrying out its evangelizing mission. Now, by at least the early 2000s, things started to go very wrong indeed, because there were allegations of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, and they began to emerge from the church. And that actually resulted in the conviction of a number of members of the church. Now, Noel Stanton, the founder, died in 2009, leaving the church to be run by an apostolic team, as they were known. In 2013, the church invited people to make disclosures about their experiences in the organization. And at some point around 2020, the church made a decision to dissolve itself, sell off its properties and businesses, and set up a compensation scheme for those affected by the abuse.
Thank you, Malcolm. That was very detailed. So who's responsible for the process of dissolution?
The people who are responsible is a main group of professional trustees. So there are professional trustees, and what is important to realize is these are people who are not from the church. So they are independent of the church. Now, these professional trustees have nearly completed the process of selling off the church's assets, and they're dealing with the various competing claims on the church's assets. Details of that process can be found on the church's websites. Now, the trustees do work with other trustees who are actually former members, but the general direction, as far as we can make out, is provided by these independent people who are appointed to dissolve the trust itself.
So the individual redress scheme is only one part of the process of closing down the church.
Absolutely. So in order to understand this rather complex process, you need to look at the church's website, and you'll see that in fact there are a number of schemes set up to compensate different types of people. So today we're going to be talking about the individual redress payment scheme, but there are other schemes that the church has set up. So for instance, they've got a scheme for something known as historic relief of need requests, as well as under 21 contribution refund requests. And the church will also consider claims made for lost national insurance contributions or employment rights. Now, there are in fact other schemes as well, but this is all the process of trying to pay off people who are owed money and people who may have claims against the church.
We've made it clear to our clients that we as solicitors can only help them with a claim to the individual redress payment scheme.
Yes, that is right. We only specialise in the individual redress payment scheme. I mean, we do point out to clients that there are these other schemes. For instance, there is a community adverse experience scheme, but we can't unfortunately help people with those other schemes. Now, we're paid a fixed sum of £2,500 plus VAT to present a claim to the individual redress payment scheme, if it is successful, that is. What we're saying to clients under our agreement is that we won't deduct anything from their compensation, save where we're asked to carry out work which we specifically advise is not going to enhance their compensation. So I think it's safe to say that pretty much all of our clients will probably get their compensation intact.
Have we made any deductions from any client's compensation so far?
We have not made any deduction from any client's compensation so far, and I think it's highly unlikely that we will do that. I mean, sometimes we do have to expend more than £2,500 plus VAT, but effectively the agreement that we have with clients is that we will present the claim, they get their money intact, we take our £2,500 plus VAT, and I think that's what is going to happen in the vast majority of cases.
So, we and our dedicated team at Lime Sisters deal with the individual redress payment scheme, but there is another compensation scheme where we do encourage all of our clients to make a separate application, even though we can't help them with that application. This is called the Community Adverse Experience Scheme. At present, this pays a support grant of £500 towards counselling, training or other support. It also gives out a written apology and an acceptance of responsibility by the church, and it will also return any outstanding capital contributions to former trust members. A trust member is defined within the scheme. What people who have been in the church need to realise is that when the church's individual redress payment scheme closes on the 31st of December 2023, the church will consider extending the community adverse experience scheme scope to provide for further compensation payments. The amount that will be paid out will be dependent on how much money the church has left. So if you submit a claim now and it is successful, you could be paid more later on, but you must submit your claim by 31st of December 2023.
Yes, once again, we can't help you with the community adverse experience scheme, but our experience is that it's fairly straightforward to make an application. You don't have to provide a statement, it's a tick box exercise, and it is well worthwhile simply registering it, because as Henna has said, it's £500 initially, plus an apology, plus capital contributions, but it could be more later. I mean, obviously, we're not sure about that.
Okay, let's now talk about what you need to qualify for the individual redress payment scheme. The church's scheme tells us precisely who gets to qualify, what they need to prove, and how much they are likely to get.
As Henna has said, if you are going to make a claim, you must do so before the 31st of December 2023. There are no exceptions, and we don't understand the church to be saying that they are going to extend that deadline. So that deadline is final.
Thirdly, you are eligible if you are any person who can establish they are or were a member of the church and or a dependent of a family member. The definition for a dependent is somebody who's under the age of 21 years and whose parent or guardian is or was a member of the church.
And once again, if you're unsure, because the scheme can be quite complex, if you're unsure, all you've got to do is ring us up and say, well, am I a dependent? Am I a member? And the church has quite detailed records, but we're here to help. Don't simply assume that because what you read, that must be the case, you haven't got a claim. You also need to produce evidence to show on the balance of probabilities that you suffered emotional or physical or sexual abuse and a recognised psychiatric injury. Now, let's just unpack that. Generally speaking, in order to know whether you've got a claim, it's really best just to ring us, because what we're finding is that people who have suffered emotional abuse, where perhaps they may not think they've got a claim, do have a claim. And our experience is that the scheme is actually quite generous. Now, there's all sorts of areas that abuse would cover, but emotional, physical and sexual abuse is as wide as it goes. But within that, people may not understand themselves to have been abused. So for instance, if you suffered abuse from your parents, the scheme does provide, and we have been told, that you may be able to make a claim, particularly if you suffered physical abuse, such as what the church used to call rodding, from your parent, and your parent has been directed to do that by the church, which we understand was quite common. So that's just one example of how wide this will go. So please don't assume that you are in some way excluded. Talk to us, because we have the experience to know when claims will work and when possibly they won't. And many people who have suffered a combination, typically they will have a combination of physical, sexual and emotional abuse. But the really important point is the church does not expect you to produce a psychiatric report. You don't have to produce a psychiatric report. The church does ask that you produce medical notes. So if you have a psychiatric condition, it will want some corroboration. And again, we can explain to you what that means and what is involved in that. But typically what we're putting forward is a statement of your experiences, which is designed to maximize your compensation, and also backed up where possible by medical therapy counselling notes.
Now, you might think that you are not eligible because you were not a member of the church or you weren't a dependent. That's not necessarily so. As Malcolm has said, and to reiterate the point again, it's really important to give us a ring so we can look at your personal circumstances and we'll give swift advice on whether you can make a claim or not.
We always look very carefully at what the scheme says. So this is about definition, and that's what we're paid to do, to look at what the scheme says. And we apply that to what we're being told by survivors of abuse. So we will ask them certain questions which are designed to elicit responses as to what really happened, and then sort out what we think will be compensated and what will not be compensated. And you lose nothing by simply asking the question.
Also, don't assume that because your abuse was emotional abuse only, that you don't have a claim. We're finding that most of the people we represent are victims of emotional abuse, and we've been able to get them compensation.
That's absolutely right. So the scheme does say that the abuse has to be perpetrated by certain types of people in certain circumstances. What we would say to people is that until we take your statement and we've spent the hours that are needed to find out what's happened to you, we can't say whether there's eligibility or not. So we can't advise you in the space of 5 seconds or 5 minutes. We need to go through that process with you to find out whether you're eligible or not.
So don't rely on anything that you are told by someone who isn't a professional or who hasn't read the scheme and who doesn't have experience of what the church is now paying to people who have successful claims.
One example is the difference between the individual redress payment scheme and the community adverse experience scheme. Now, we deal with both types of experience. We set them out in a statement. And the reason why we do that is so that we can clearly delineate to the church and their solicitors what we consider to be claimable and what is not claimable.
So the difference between both schemes can be a very subtle one, which is why we need to take a detailed statement from you. Very briefly, the individual redress payment scheme is about abuse that's targeted at the victim by an individual or a group of individuals, whereas the community adverse experience is more about the general atmosphere of the church. So by way of example, the community adverse experience scheme would cover children who experience exorcisms or hellfire sermons and women who were treated as subordinates by the church.
But that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, that's a generalization, which is why people have to be very careful. As I say, you just need to talk to us. We can explain the difference, but what we do is ensure that your statement deals with the kind of abuse that will come under the individual redress payment scheme.
Just moving on to compensation. Malcolm, can you tell us how much people are getting in terms of compensation?
Yes, well, here the actual scheme can be a bit confusing and it might put people off, which is why, again, you need to speak to us, because there's a tariff set out in the scheme. So you get a fixed sum for a certain type of abuse. So for instance, if you suffered an indecent assault over clothing, you are paid £4,000. Now, some people might look at that and think, well, that's all I'm going to get. Now, that's not the case, because within the tariff, there is a section entitled psychiatric injury, and that says The section says that where people suffer psychological stress or psychiatric injury, they will be awarded at least £1,500. But awards under this section follow the kinds of awards made by civil courts. Now, civil courts use something called the Judicial Court Guidelines, as well as reported cases from courts. And that has a section on abuse. And the awards in the most severe categories go right up to £120,000. Now, that's a really important point, as Henna is about to tell us.
Yeah, so what we're finding in practice is that the church and their lawyers are being very flexible rather than following this tariff slavishly. So they're looking at the case in the same way that a court would. They look at the seriousness of the abuse and then the short and long-term consequences of the abuse on the victim.
So it's fair to say that people who suffer sexual abuse may well get more than those who report physical, emotional abuse, but that doesn't always follow, particularly if the effects of that physical or emotional abuse are very serious indeed.
So what we are seeing is awards that are similar to those that a civil court might award. What is important is that your statement should describe in as much detail as possible what happened to you, who was responsible, and what the consequences to you as a person were. That's what we can do for you. Whatever you do, please do not draft your own statement because you could end up making your claim a lot more difficult for us to deal with.
Also, because we're seeing how much people are getting under the scheme, we can give you some idea how much we think you might get when you come to us.
It's important to remember that under the individual redress payment scheme, you cannot claim for loss of earnings or therapy or care as you would be able to in a civil court. There is just one award that is made.
So what do you need to make a claim? Well, first of all, you need to contact us so we can explain how things work. We need to make a quick check of whether you might be eligible, and then we need to offer you an agreement. Now, once the agreement is signed, we'll take your statement. Now, this can take some hours, but we do our level best not to let the process distress you. Once you've had the chance to read your statement, you can sign it, and we then make your application to the church, which is done online. We also set about getting whatever medical or therapy records that we think are going to help your case.
It is possible under the scheme for us and the church to instruct an independent psychiatrist to examine you, but so far we're advising all of our clients not to take that route. The reason is that a psychiatric report could slow down your claim by several months, and it may well not make a difference to the amount of compensation you actually receive. Finally, this step is only really intended for extremely serious cases.
Let's talk about now how much time it takes for the process to run through.
Yeah, so we find that we can generally get your statement ready within a month of taking on your case. Thereafter, what we're finding is that offers are taking something like 3 to 4 months to come through. Some people have to wait longer, but this is much better than other compensation schemes that we have dealt with at Lime Solicitors, where survivors of abuse have had to wait anything from 2 years upwards to get a compensation. So we are joined by Philippa and Rebecca, who were members of the Jesus Fellowship Church. Both Philippa and Rebecca have made claims through the individual redress scheme. Welcome to our podcast and thank you for joining us. My first question is to Philippa. When did you first approach Lime Solicitors?
Hi, Henna. So I approached Malcolm Johnson in around October 2019.
Okay, thank you. Who took your statement and how did you find the statement process?
I'm pretty sure it was Malcolm that I first spoke to, and he took my statement in sort of 2 to 3 parts.
Mm-hmm.
He was very professional and attentive, and if I needed to sort of take time out during that process, then I could. My statement was submitted to the scheme in mid-December 2022.
Thank you. My next question is to you, Rebecca. How did you find the general atmosphere of giving your statement?
It was pretty simple and straightforward. Malcolm took my statement. It took about 3 hours, and then he sent it to me, and I had the opportunity to make amends to my statement and ensure that I was completely happy. I added quite a bit to it that I'd sort of forgotten to say, or that I felt was important to make particular points, and then I just sent it back, and I think and it got sent off then.
Okay, thank you. Were you kept informed along the way? Were you updated by Malcolm?
I was informed that it had been submitted, and if I ever had any questions, or I just emailed, and somebody got back to me within a couple of days.
That's great. So can you tell me a bit about your feelings and emotions that were involved when you actually gave your statement?
It was very difficult sort of going over what had happened and, you know, actually voicing it. But it was quite helpful that the questions were quite specific, and Malcolm knows quite a lot about the church anyway, so he was able to ask specific questions about specific scenarios, so I could just focus on answering those questions rather than rambling on and on about everything that happened.
Thank you. Philippa, I'm coming back to you. What would you describe as being the most difficult part of the process?
Well, a couple of points, I think. I really struggled to remember people's names when giving my statement, because we only knew people by virtue names, which were sort of names given to people. So often we didn't know their surnames. And sometimes it's just hard to remember that far back, but it wasn't a problem. I think secondly, once my statement was sent to me, I took a few weeks to actually get round to reading it and to getting it ready to be submitted. I'd realised I didn't actually want to do it on my own, but actually I had a really kind friend who offered to do it with me, and that just sort of seemed to help me somehow to get it sent off and submitted. I think it was just hard to read those bad experiences and everything out loud, and, you know, realising that was actually my childhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was one
It was
point.
it was actually a big, it was a big relief to send it back to Malcolm and to kind of get that bit done.
Yeah. Have either of you found any criticisms with the scheme?
I think the timescales provided by the church weren't exactly helpful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think they've sort of struggled. They had an ideal. They wanted to be able to sort of get back to people and pay people within 3 months, but actually realistically that's not achievable, so they are taking longer to respond in some instances. It does depend whether you've waiting to hear from the individual redress payment, because obviously that's through yourselves or other solicitors, to do with the sort of community adverse experience. Again, sometimes there have been delays there.
Okay.
I'm still waiting for an offer, even though I think my claim was submitted in middle of January. It's been quite a number of months. We're getting on for 5 months now.
Yeah, it's quite hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you on the timescale point. However, I think it's worth mentioning, Malcolm did have a meeting with the church trustee and solicitors last week, and we have been informed there has been problems with processing large number of claims. However, the church has reassured us that claims are being progressed swiftly, so we are likely to see some more offers coming through in the next couple of weeks. Finally, have either of you got any advice for anyone who's listening and is thinking of making an application to the individual redress payment scheme?
I mean, I'd say definitely ring a solicitor if you're unsure in any way. I mean, my recommendation is Malcolm and Henna, because they've helped me and other people that I know. But it's if you're unsure, it's just they'll know if your claim is, if you're eligible and if it's worth making a statement. So it's definitely give it a go.
Yeah, it's just worth having that conversation, because then you know one way or another, and you don't then have to think about it, so, just wondering whether you should or not.
And also time is of the essence now.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got just over 6 months left in the scheme, and I'm really keen for people to get their claims in.
Yeah, I mean, we know there's a huge number of sort of children and adults part of the church, and I say quite a small number of people have actually applied overall. And I think I wouldn't say it's disappointing, but we want to reach out to those people who are maybe struggling with it, or thinking, should they or shouldn't they? And it's worth it, definitely, even if it brings a small closure for some people to that chapter in their lives.
Thank you both. And just to confirm, the cut-off point is 31st of December 2023, and you will not be able to make a claim through the scheme after this date. Thank you both for joining us. It's been extremely helpful to have your insight. Malcolm, when an offer is accepted, how long does it take for the compensation to come through?
Well, the good news there is that when we do accept an offer, it doesn't actually take as long as you might expect. Generally, we find that once we've put the papers in, because you have to sign a piece of paper basically consenting to the settlement, but once it goes in, we find that the money hits our account within about a month. Now, once that money's in our account, then we will send it straight on to you. In order for us to send it to you, we do have to obviously undertake various checks. In other words, you have to be sure that we've got the right bank account. That's obviously common sense, but we can do it very quickly. But it's about a month, we find.
Yeah, and just to confirm, we can't guarantee any timescales, but we can tell you what is happening based on those of our clients who have already accepted their compensations.
There's just one other thing that we want to cover, and that is there an appeal process? And unfortunately, no, there isn't. So if an offer is made, you can ask for a review, but unlike other schemes where there is a formal appeal process, you can only just ask for the church to reconsider. Now, that's something that we are doing in some claims, basically. But if the church refuses to increase the award, and as far as the scheme is concerned, unfortunately, there's very little that we can do about that. So, in conclusion, I'd like to thank all our speakers today. If you were part of the Jesus Army or you have some involvement with them, please ring us and find out if we're going to be able to help you. We can't guarantee you a successful claim, but what we do have is we have a dedicated team of people who know the scheme inside out, and we think we'll be able to help you. So thank you for listening.